The river was hungry that day. It didn't just flow, it roared, a beast of mud and foam swollen by the spring thaw. And it had just eaten a canoe, splintering the wood against the rocks like bone. Two women were thrown into the churning water, their screams swallowed by the river's thunder. On the far bank, the village went mad with panic. Mothers cried out, children hid their faces. The current was a dark, angry god, and it was dragging two of their own into the underworld. It had chosen them for sacrifice, but someone else was there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. He was a stranger, a ghost on horseback riding the high trail along the bluffs. Nobody knew his name because he never stayed long enough for them to ask. He was just the cowboy, a man wrapped in the dust of 1,000 lonely miles, his face a permanent shadow under the brim of his hat. He wasn't looking for a home. He was just looking for the next horizon to ride toward. But then he heard the screams. Something inside him, something buried deep under all that dust and distance, moved faster than thought. He didn't hesitate. His coat hit the dirt, the saddle was flung aside, and his boots were pounding toward the bank before the tribe's own warriors could even move. They stood frozen, paralyzed. They knew that river. They knew it was a death sentence. The cowboy didn't care. He hit the water, and the cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing him all at once. The current grabbed him, trying to pull him down, to make him another sacrifice. But he fought back. His arms churned, his legs kicked, every muscle screaming as he battled the monster. He saw one of them first, the younger girl, maybe 18. Her black hair was a tangled mess in the water, her body limp, spinning in the torrent. He lunged, his fingers closing around her wrist. He felt the faintest sputter of breath against his shoulder as he hauled her toward the shore. They crashed onto the muddy bank, a mess of tangled limbs and roots. Hands from the village reached down, pulling her up, pulling her to safety. The cowboy didn't have time for a breath. His eyes were already scanning the water again. And that's when he saw the second one. She was older, stronger, but she was losing. Her long braid had snagged on a half-submerged log, and the river was using it as an anchor to drown her. Her arms thrashed, getting weaker by the second. Without a thought, the cowboy threw himself back in. The world dissolved into a blur of brown water and crushing pressure. His lungs were on fire. He clawed blindly at the branches, his knuckles tearing open, until he felt the braid come free. He hooked an arm around her chest and kicked for the surface. They broke through with a desperate, ragged gasp that was more sob than breath. He didn't have the strength to fight the current directly, so he used it, guiding them downstream toward a bend in the shore. A dozen hands grabbed her, pulling her from his grasp. He collapsed face down in the mud, his chest heaving, every part of him burning. The village's cries of terror had turned to cries of disbelief. The two sisters lay on the bank, coughing up water, trembling but alive. The younger one clutched her sister's hand, and they both stared at the stranger. Their eyes weren't just filled with gratitude. It was something else. Awe. Confusion. It was as if a legend had just walked out of the wilderness to save them, wearing nothing but a dust-stained shirt and the scars of a hard life. As night fell, they built a fire. They sang songs of his courage. They placed food before him, but he barely touched it. He just stared into the flames, seeing the river, seeing those faces slipping under the water. He didn't want their thanks. He didn't want their praise. He just wanted the feeling of the river's cold grip to leave his bones. The chief, a tall, silent man with eyes that had seen 100 winters, watched the stranger. He measured him, his silence holding more weight than any words. His daughters, the two women the cowboy had pulled from the jaws of death, sat beside him, wrapped in warm furs. They couldn't stop looking at the cowboy, as if trying to understand what he was. Dawn came, and with it, a decision. The cowboy had his horse saddled and ready. He was a drifter. He had done what he had to do, and now it was time to disappear back into the wilderness. He didn't belong here. He never belonged anywhere. But as he went to mount his horse, the chief stepped in front of him. The whole village had gathered, silent and watchful. The chief's voice was deep and steady, carrying the authority of generations. "By the sacred laws of our people," he said, his eyes locked on the cowboys, "when a man saves a woman from the spirit world, her life belongs to him. It is not a choice, it is fate." The cowboy's hand froze on his saddle horn. He could feel every eye in the village on him. A cold dread, colder than the river, began to creep up his spine. The chief wasn't finished. His gaze was as hard and unyielding as granite. "You saved two." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. The two sisters clutched each other, their faces pale. "Tomorrow," the chief declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you will marry them both." The world seemed to stop. The cowboy had wrestled these women from a river, and now he was drowning in a tradition he couldn't fight. He looked at the sisters. They weren't looking at him with fear, but with a quiet, terrifying acceptance of what their father had decreed. The stranger, the man with no name, had just been given a future he never wanted, in a place he never meant to stay. The river hadn't taken his life, it had taken his freedom. That night was the longest of the cowboy's life. He sat by the fire, a prisoner of honor, surrounded by a language he didn't speak and a law he didn't understand. He was a man who had built his entire existence on being alone, on being able to ride away from anything and anyone. Now, two lives were shackled to his by a debt he couldn't repay. He kept seeing their faces in the flames, the terror in their eyes as the river pulled them down. He had reached in and pulled them out. But in doing so, he had somehow tied a knot that could never be undone. The younger sister came to him first. Her name was Willow. She moved like a whisper, her feet barely making a sound on the packed earth. She knelt by his fire, her hand still trembling slightly. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was soft, like wind chimes. She told him she had prayed for the river to show mercy. Instead, it sent him. She didn't ask for promises. She didn't ask for love. She only asked that he be kind. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. It wasn't love, not yet. It was the heavy, aching weight of being needed. An hour later, her sister came. Her name was Kestrel. She was different. Where Willow was gentle, Kestrel was steel. She stood tall, her chin held high, though he could see the storm raging in her eyes. She told him the law was not a cage, but an honor. To marry them was not a burden, but a gift, a life given in return for the lives he had saved. Her words were proud, defiant. She was a warrior, carrying the weight of her people's traditions on her shoulders. But as he looked closer, he saw the flicker of fear behind the pride. The fear of being a prize. The fear of being cast aside by the very man who had saved her. After they left, he was alone again, but the silence was different. It was filled with their presence. He had always been a ghost, a man passing through. Now two souls were tethered to his. He thought about his own past, about the endless empty nights. He had run from connection his whole life. He wondered if the river hadn't just been a random accident. He wondered if it had chosen him, pulling him into a life he was too afraid to choose for himself. He never slept. By morning, the drums had started, a low, steady rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The whole village was gathered. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and sacred herbs. Willow and Kestrel stood before the ceremonial fire, their faces painted with sacred clay, their deerskin dresses adorned with intricate patterns of quills and beads that shimmered in the dawn light. The chief stood between them, holding a feathered staff, his voice booming as he declared that the spirits of the river and the mountain had bound these three lives together, that the cord was sacred, that no one could ever break it. The cowboy took a slow step forward. His boots felt like lead. His heart felt like it was being torn in two. This was it. This was the end of his life as he knew it. He was about to become a husband, a member of a tribe, a man with roots. But just as the chief began the final chant, a scream ripped through the air from the edge of the forest. It wasn't a cry of celebration, it was a cry of warning. And then they came. Raiders, pouring out of the trees like a plague, men with hungry eyes and rifles in their hands. They weren't here for a wedding. They were here for blood and steel. The ceremony dissolved into chaos. The tribe scattered, warriors grabbing for their weapons, mothers shielding their children. The drums went silent, replaced by the crack of gunfire. Willow and Kestrel froze, their faces a mask of disbelief and terror. The new life that had been forced upon them was about to be destroyed before it could even begin. But the cowboy didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He planted his feet in the dirt right in front of them, his hand moving in a blur. The revolver was in his grip, spitting fire before the first raider had even reached the clearing. He became a wall, a shield of denim and iron will. Each shot was a vow, a promise he hadn't spoken but was now making with lead and gunpowder. He was declaring to the world that these women, this tribe, this unwanted life, it was his to protect. The raiders charged, expecting easy plunder. They found a demon instead. The tribe, seeing his stand, rallied. Bows were drawn, old rifles were aimed, and a warrior's cry rose up to meet the gunfire. In the chaos, a torch was knocked over, and the ceremonial fire erupted, flames leaping up the side of the chief's lodge. The world became a whirlwind of smoke, screams, and explosions. The cowboy's eyes stung, but he didn't back down. Willow was at his side, her fear gone, replaced by a fierce calm as she reloaded a spare pistol for him. Kestrel was on his other side, a long knife in her hand, her movements deadly and precise. She wasn't a bride. She was a lioness defending her territory. The three of them fought together, not as a man and his two new wives, but as a single, unstoppable force. They were a whirlwind of bullets, blades, and pure, raw courage. The raiders had come for sheep and had found wolves. Their attack faltered, their confidence shattered against the unified defense. They broke and ran, melting back into the forest, leaving their dead behind. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the spreading fire and the ragged gasps of the survivors. The cowboy slowly lowered his gun, his chest heaving. Sweat and soot covered his face. He felt two pairs of hands grab onto his arms, and he looked down to see Willow and Kestrel clinging to him, their tears cutting clean streaks through the clay paint on their faces. The chief walked toward them through the smoke, his face grim but his eyes filled with a new understanding. He placed a heavy hand on the cowboy's shoulder. "The law of the river bound you to us," the chief said, his voice raspy, "but it is the trial by fire that has made you one of us." He looked from the cowboy to his daughters, his gaze lingering on their intertwined hands. "You are not just their savior. You are their husband, and you are no longer a stranger." The cowboy looked at the two women. Their hands were trembling, but their grip was strong. He saw no fear in their eyes now, only a deep, unshakable bond that had been forged in the heart of the flames. He didn't know if it was love. He didn't know what it was. But the cold, hollow place in his chest, the one he had carried for as long as he could remember, was finally starting to feel warm. The fire burned behind them, cleansing the village, and as the sun rose higher, the cowboy realized the truth. The river hadn't drowned him. It had baptized him. It had carried him to this exact moment, to the end of his loneliness. But as he looked out at the vast, unforgiving plains, a tremor of unease still echoed in his heart. He knew that a destiny this powerful was never this simple. And he was right. The worst was yet to come. The days that followed were a blur of smoke and sweat. The village was wounded, but not broken. They buried their dead with quiet songs and rebuilt their homes with a grim determination. The cowboy worked alongside them, his hands, once used to nothing but reins and a revolver, now learning the feel of an axe and a hammer. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was too tired to think. But he couldn't outrun the questions. Who were those raiders? And why did they attack with such specific, personal fury? Kestrel was the key. He could feel it. He saw the way she looked toward the forest, not with fear, but with a burning, watchful anger. The raid hadn't been random. She knew who they were. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally asked her, who was he, the one leading them? Kestrel's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she would refuse to answer. Then she looked at him, her eyes dark pools of memory. His name is Scar, she said, her voice low and tight. My father promised me to him, a political alliance to protect our lands. The pieces started to click into place. The canoe, the river, it all made a horrifying kind of sense. You weren't in an accident, were you? The cowboy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Willow, sitting nearby, flinched as if struck. Kestrel didn't look away. No, she admitted. It was an escape. I would rather drown in the river than belong to that man. Willow tried to stop me. She thought she could reason with me. The canoe overturned in our struggle. So that was it. The entire story he'd been told was a lie. He hadn't just stumbled into a random tragedy. He had intervened in a desperate last-ditch attempt at freedom. He hadn't saved them from the river. He'd saved Kestrel from a monster, and in doing so, had painted a target on the entire village. He had made her enemy his enemy, and Scar was not the kind of man to accept defeat. He would be back. Not just for Kestrel, but for the man who had taken his place. For the stranger who had stolen his prize. The cowboy felt a cold fury rise within him. He looked at the chief, who now seemed smaller, older. He had been used. The sacred law, the wedding, it was all a desperate ploy. The chief had seen a gunman, a fighter, and had used his own daughter's tragedy to bind that gun to his cause. He had sacrificed the cowboy's freedom to ensure his family's safety. The honor he had felt after the battle curdled into resentment. He was a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. He was a guard dog, chained by a law he had been tricked into honoring. That night, he packed his saddlebags in the darkness. He was a drifter. He had been a fool to think he could be anything else. He would take his horse and ride, disappear, let them fight their own battles. He owed them nothing. He crept toward the edge of the village, the sleeping lodges like dark mounds against the starry sky. But as he passed the temporary shelter where Willow and Kestrel slept, he heard a sound. A small, muffled sob. It was Willow. He paused, hidden in the shadows, and listened. He will leave us, she whispered to her sister. He knows the truth now. Why would he stay? We are not his people. This is not his fight. There was a long silence, and then Kestrel's voice, stripped of its usual fire, answered. Because if he leaves, she said, her voice trembling with a vulnerability he had never heard before, Scar will come, and this time he will burn everything to the ground, and it will be my fault. The words hit the cowboy harder than any bullet. He stood there, frozen in the darkness, the reins of his horse feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He could ride away. He could be free. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he did, he would be leaving them to die. He would be running away, not from a fight, but from the only thing that had ever felt real in his empty life. He was trapped, not by the chief's law, but by his own conscience. And he knew that Scar was coming. The real battle hadn't even begun. He didn't leave. He couldn't. The next morning, he walked into the center of the village, not as a drifter ready to flee, but as a man preparing for war. He didn't speak to the chief. He didn't need to. The old man saw the look in his eyes and knew the cowboy had made his choice. Instead, he gathered the half-dozen warriors the village had left. They were brave men, but they were hunters, not soldiers. They were armed with bows and a few old hunting rifles. They were no match for Scar's raiders. The cowboy knew they couldn't win a straight fight. Their only chance was to be smarter, to use the land itself as a weapon. He spent the next few days walking every inch of the surrounding woods. He found a narrow canyon that could be turned into a deadly ambush. He found a series of caves that could shelter the women and children. He worked relentlessly, his mind sharp and focused. For the first time, he wasn't just passing through a place. He was learning it, understanding it, preparing to defend it. Willow was always there, a quiet shadow at his side. She brought him water. She learned to clean and load his revolver. She watched him with a deep, trusting gaze that made his chest ache. She had a gentle spirit, but underneath it was a resilience that surprised him. She was the calm heart of the storm that was coming. Kestrel was different. She argued with him, she challenged his plans, she questioned his tactics. "You think a few traps will stop an army?" she sneered one afternoon. "You are an outsider, you do not know our enemy." But her arguments weren't born of distrust. They were born of fear. And beneath the arguments, she was watching him, learning from him. She pointed out hidden game trails that could be used for flanking maneuvers. She showed him which plants could be used to create thick, acrid smoke. She was a warrior, and she was slowly, grudgingly, starting to see him as an ally, not a jailer. One evening, as they worked together setting a deadfall trap on a high ridge, she finally broke her silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not looking at him. "You are free. My father's law is a lie. Why stay and die with us?" The cowboy stopped what he was doing and looked out over the valley where the village lights twinkled in the dusk. He thought about all the towns he'd drifted through, all the faces he'd forgotten. They were just ghosts in his past. But this place, these people, they were real. "I've been running my whole life," he said, his voice rough. "I'm tired of it. Maybe some things are worth standing for." Kestrel said nothing, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It might have been respect. It might have been something more. The next day, a scout came sprinting into the village, his face pale with terror. He had seen them. A war party, at least 3 times the size of the first one. They were moving slowly, deliberately, like wolves stalking their prey, and they were being led by a man on a massive black horse. A man with a face so badly scarred it looked like a twisted mask. Scar had come back to claim what was his, and to burn everything else to ash. The cowboy felt a strange calm settle over him. The waiting was over. He looked at Willow, who gave him a small, brave smile. He looked at Kestrel, who nodded once, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. The trap was set. The warriors were in position. The women and children were hidden. All that was left was to spring it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody shades of red and orange, the sound of a war horn echoed through the valley. It was a long, mournful sound, filled with the promise of death. The final battle for the village, for Kestrel's freedom, and for the cowboy's soul had begun. The attack came at dusk, just as the cowboy had predicted. Scar was arrogant. He thought the village was already broken, that its spirit had died with the men from his first raid. He sent his warriors charging into the clearing without caution, expecting to meet only terror. Instead, they met a volley of arrows from the trees. And then the ground erupted. The cowboy had spent days digging pits, lining them with sharpened stakes and covering them with branches. The front line of the raiders vanished into the earth with strangled screams. Confusion turned to chaos. Scar roared orders, but his voice was lost in the growing panic. The cowboy fired his rifle from a concealed position on the ridge, his shots precise, methodical. He wasn't aiming for kills. He was aiming for their leaders, the men trying to rally the others. One by one, they fell. The raiders were a swarm without a queen, buzzing in leaderless confusion. Kestrel was beside him, a phantom in the fading light. Her bow sang, and with every note, another raider fell. She wasn't fighting like a woman defending her home. She was fighting like an avenging spirit, taking back her life one arrow at a time. But Scar was a veteran of 100 brutal fights. He recovered quickly. He saw that the main clearing was a trap, and ordered his men to pull back and circle around, to attack the village from the forested canyon on the west. It was exactly what the cowboy had been waiting for. The canyon was narrow, a natural choke point. The tribe's remaining warriors were hidden in the rocks above, armed with boulders and burning logs. As the raiders poured into the narrow pass, a signal was given. The world came crashing down on them. Boulders the size of men crushed their ranks, and a wall of fire sealed the entrance, trapping them inside. It was a slaughter. The raiders, caught between fire and falling rock, broke completely. They scrambled over each other, trying to escape the inferno. The cowboy, Kestrel, and a handful of warriors charged down from the ridge, cutting off their retreat. The battle was turning. Victory seemed within their grasp, but then the cowboy saw him. Scar. He hadn't gone into the canyon. He and a small group of his most elite fighters had used the main attack as a diversion, slipping around the other side of the village, heading straight for the caves. He wasn't here for the village. He was here for Kestrel, and he knew where they had hidden the women and children. A cold dread seized the cowboy. He had been outmaneuvered. "The caves!" he yelled to Kestrel. Her face went white with horror. They turned and ran, sprinting through the woods, the sounds of the dying battle behind them fading as a new, more terrible urgency spurred them on. They had to get there first. They had to protect Willow. As they burst into the clearing near the cave entrance, they saw they were too late. Scar and his men were there, dragging the women and children out into the open. And in the center of it all was Willow, a knife held to her throat by the scarred man himself. "You!" Scar bellowed when he saw the cowboy, his scarred face twisting into a hideous grin. "The outsider! You stole my bride. Now you will watch as I take everything from you." He pressed the knife harder against Willow's throat. Willow didn't scream. She just looked at the cowboy, her eyes wide with terror, but also with an unwavering trust. Kestrel let out a choked cry, her bow useless while he held her sister hostage. The cowboy slowed to a walk, his hands raised to show they were empty. "Let her go, Scar," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me." Scar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "There is no you and me. There is only what is mine." He shoved Willow toward one of his men. "Kill the others," he snarled, pointing at the terrified women and children. "But leave the sister. I want her to watch." But as his man moved to obey, something happened that no one expected. Willow, who had seemed so paralyzed with fear, suddenly moved. She stomped down hard on the foot of the man holding her and drove her elbow back into his gut. As he doubled over with a grunt of pain, she lunged for a burning torch that had been dropped near the cave mouth. She wasn't a warrior like Kestrel. She wasn't a gunslinger like the cowboy, but she was the chief's daughter, and she would not be a victim. With a defiant scream, she threw the torch, not at Scar, but at a pile of dry brush and oil-soaked rags the cowboy had stored near the cave entrance. It was their last, most desperate trap. The pile went up in a massive, explosive whoosh of fire, creating a roaring wall of flame that separated Scar and his men from their hostages. The raid was over. The battle was won. But the fight for their lives had just begun. The wall of fire raged, a roaring curtain between them. For a moment, everyone was stunned into silence. Scar recovered first, his face a mask of fury in the flickering light. He had been tricked, his victory snatched away at the last possible second by the quiet girl he had dismissed as weak. He roared in frustration and lunged toward the flames, but the heat drove him back. On the other side of the fire, the cowboy didn't waste a second. He grabbed Willow and Kestrel, pulling them away from the blaze and toward the relative safety of the rocks. The other women and children scrambled after them. They were safe for now. But the fire was spreading, consuming the dry woods with terrifying speed. Soon, the whole area would be an inferno, and Scar was not giving up. The cowboy could hear him on the other side of the fire, his voice raw with hatred, screaming promises of what he would do when the flames died down. They were trapped. They had won the battle, but they were about to lose the war to the fire itself. The chief and his warriors, having finished the fight in the canyon, saw the blaze and came running. Their faces fell when they saw the situation. Their families were on one side of an impassable wall of fire, and a bloodthirsty enemy was on the other. "There is another way," Kestrel said, her voice tight with urgency. "An old tunnel, behind the caves. It leads to the river. We used it to hide as children." It was their only chance. The cowboy nodded. He turned to the chief. "Get your people out. We'll hold him off as long as we can." The chief looked at him, his eyes filled with a grief and respect that went beyond words. He knew what the cowboy was offering, to stay behind, to buy them time with his own life. "You are my son," the chief said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he turned and began ushering his people toward the hidden tunnel. Willow hesitated. She looked at the cowboy, her eyes pleading. "Come with us," she begged. "Don't do this." He looked at her, at the strength and courage she had shown, and he felt a pang in his chest so sharp it almost brought him to his knees. He gently touched her cheek. "I told you I was tired of running," he said softly. "Go. Live." He then turned to Kestrel. She was looking at him, her warrior's mask completely gone, her face stripped bare with a raw, painful emotion he couldn't name. She simply nodded, a universe of understanding passing between them in that one small gesture. Then she turned and followed her sister into the darkness of the tunnel. The cowboy was alone. He stood before the roaring fire, his revolver in his hand, and waited. He could hear Scar on the other side, his men using their cloaks to beat at the edges of the fire, trying to create a path through. It wouldn't be long now. The cowboy checked the bullets in his gun. 6 shots. He didn't know how many men Scar had left. It didn't matter. He wasn't planning on surviving. He was just planning on taking as many of them with him as he could. He was a drifter, a ghost. It seemed fitting that he would die here, in a blaze of glory, defending a home he had never known he was looking for. The flames began to die down in one section. A path was clearing. He could see their silhouettes moving through the smoke. He raised his gun, his hand steady, his heart calm. This was it, the end of the line. But just as the first of Scar's men stepped through the fire, an arrow sprouted from his chest. The man collapsed without a sound. The cowboy stared in disbelief, and then he saw her. Kestrel. She hadn't gone into the tunnel. She stood on a high ledge of rock, her bow drawn, a silent angel of death outlined against the fiery sky. She had come back for him. She had chosen to stay and fight, to die with him if she had to. And she wasn't alone. From the other side of the clearing, Willow appeared, leading the handful of remaining warriors. They hadn't run either. They had circled around using the game trails Kestrel had shown him to attack Scar from behind. Willow was not holding a weapon. She was holding a torch. And in her eyes was not the gentle calm of before, but the cold, hard fury of a woman defending her family. The cowboy had been tricked by the chief, saved by the daughters, and now he was being defended by the entire tribe. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was the heart of their defense. Scar, seeing his men being attacked from all sides, let out a final, desperate roar of pure rage. He ignored the warriors. He ignored Kestrel on the ridge. He charged straight through the dying flames, his eyes locked on the cowboy. This was personal. The cowboy met his charge. The two men crashed together in a brutal explosion of violence. There were no guns, no fancy moves, just a desperate, primal struggle for survival in the smoke and ash. They rolled on the ground, trading blows, the world shrinking until it was nothing but the scarred face of the man trying to kill him. But the cowboy was no longer fighting alone. He was fighting for the quiet girl who had trusted him, for the warrior woman who had come back for him, for the people who had taken him in. He felt a strength he had never known before. He managed to get his hands on a rock and brought it down hard on Scar's head. The man grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all the cowboy needed. He rolled free, got to his feet, and delivered a final, decisive blow. Scar collapsed, his reign of terror finally over. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged breaths of the survivors. The village was saved. The cowboy stood over Scar's body, his chest heaving, his body bruised and battered, but he was alive. He looked up and saw Willow and Kestrel running toward him. They didn't stop until they crashed into him, all three of them clinging to each other in a tangle of relief and exhaustion. They had done it. Together. They had faced the fire and walked out of it. In the days that followed, a new sense of peace settled over the village. They rebuilt, not with grim determination this time, but with a hopeful energy. The captured raiders were given a choice: join the tribe and live by their laws, or be exiled into the wilderness. Most chose to stay. The tribe was stronger than it had been before. The cowboy watched it all, feeling like he was seeing the world for the first time. He was no longer a ghost. He had a name. He had a home. One evening, the chief came to him. "The law I used to bind you was a deception born of a father's fear," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "You are free. The debt has been paid 1,000 times over. You can leave, and no one will think less of you." The cowboy looked at the chief, the man who had tricked him, who had used him, but who had also given him the one thing he had never been able to find for himself: a family. He looked over at the fire where Willow was laughing, her gentle spirit shining brighter than ever. He saw Kestrel sparring with the young warriors, her strength and fire now a source of inspiration, not anger. He had a choice. He could take his horse and ride off toward the horizon, back to the lonely freedom he had always known. Or he could stay. He could accept this strange, complicated, beautiful life that fate had thrown at him. He thought about the cold river, the hot fire, and the two women who had stood by his side through it all. He thought about the hollow ache in his chest that was finally gone. He turned back to the chief and smiled. "I think I'll stay," he said. "I think I'm already home." The wedding that followed wasn't one of law or of obligation. It was a celebration of survival, of courage, and of a love forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The drifter, the two sisters, and the tribe had become one family, bound not by a river or a fire, but by something much, much stronger. If you enjoyed this story of a hero finding his home in the heart of danger, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what other incredible tales of bravery and unexpected fate are waiting just around the corner.